Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how Britain's belated and half-arsed attempts at social distancing are not going very well and what I think that is essentially down to. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, first of all, looking at this graph, this has been pretty stark. People are sharing this a lot on social media. This is from the Financial Times. And what it does is it plots the rate of propagation, the rate of deaths, quite frankly. And what we can see on this, in the UK, there is still that element of, because it's not real yet, because the number of deaths, which is far too high already, but it was a number that we were going to get to at some point, is still quite low. We're still sort of behind a lot of other countries. At the end of the day, we're an island quite far away from China. It took a while to get here. And it's not really real for a lot of people yet. I mean, in the region I'm in, people are talking about the fact, oh, we've got, there's like still single figures of confirmed cases. Now, part of that is because we're not testing, but that's another issue I'll come on to. But where we are here, we're looking at the situation, and people pointed out, well, in Italy, where everyone will agree that the situation is largely out of control in Italy, it's already exceeded the number of deaths that China has had. Of course, what did China do differently? Locked down, immediate lockdown. That's not to say that Italy have necessarily, played loose and fast with people's lives. Much more difficult to do that in a democracy than a totalitarian state. But when Italy got to its first 10 deaths, a week later it was on 80. In the UK, when we got to our first 10, which was later on, a week later we're on 144. The curve is steeper for us. And the problem is that even if everything were to be done right, even now, we would overtake at the same point Italy's death rate. Things are set into motion. A lot of people struggle to understand that. They'll think to themselves, oh, well, it hasn't happened yet, so if we do this or this, we can maybe stave it off. Things are in motion now that cannot be stopped. It's very much like the oft-used analogy of the cliff. We've jumped off a cliff, and then we're thinking to ourselves, or maybe I won't hit the ground. No. And so we're already, as a result of our inaction, going to suffer many, many, many more deaths than should otherwise have been the case. Of course, you couldn't possibly prevent all deaths as a result of this, but we are going to suffer many, many more. And because we're still not doing the right thing, at the moment, you look at it and you think to yourself, we are still doing less than Italy, and our curve is already steeper. It's already steeper. Look at it. And we're doing less. Spain's is a bit steep, and we're doing less than them, for goodness sake. They were quite late on there. Hopefully they'll level theirs off a bit. Hopefully we will as well. Hopefully. In fact, by the time you're watching this, hopefully there's been another announcement of genuine action to be taken. Because we have to distinguish between what the government say but then don't do and what they actually do. So what is this down to? Why are we not practicing social distancing in this country? Part of it, of course, came down to the government, inevitably, in two ways. First of all, the government are not insisting on it. They're just suggesting it now. They're suggesting social distancing. A suggestion isn't really working on a lot of people, and it doesn't matter, what proportion of that population is. It's a large enough, even if it's a minority, it's a large enough minority that they can still propagate this infection. And, because we are inevitably going to come into contact with these lunatics at some point. So they're threatening all of our lives because they're not following the government advice. But the government shouldn't have just advised it. They should have enforced it to a certain extent. Now, part of the problem is, of course, Boris Johnson and his like have spent all this time, because fundamentally this comes from the Brexit attitude as well, have spent all this time saying how the EU constrain our lives and force us to do things, which is all complete nonsense. You ask a single Brexiteer what the EU have ever made them do, they can't name a single thing that isn't a lie without resorting to bendy bananas, and that's a lie. But they've spent all that time doing that. They don't feel they can then move to a situation where they're telling us. Because what happens once they can tell pubs and restaurants to close down, but then they'll have to pay compensation. They're trying to avoid doing that. They say there's support for businesses. They say they don't want any decent businesses to go under and that the support is available for them, but it's not. that is itself a lie, because if it were, they would just say, well, look, the way to stop people going to bars and restaurants and other crowded places is to close them down. The only places that have been closed down so far have been closed down by councils. Council properties, basically. Sports centres, clubs, things like that. Private businesses, no, because the government are just... They're basically trying to have those places go out of business. They're trying to make them fail. Because by telling the population not to go to them, but not telling those places itself to close down, they're throwing them to the wolves. So that is one element. The other element is the media. So, for example, when Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, was telling the public not to go to pubs, his father was on the television saying, well, I'm going. What message does that send? We've just had the owner of Wetherspoons, which is a large pub chain in this country, who happens to be very pro-Brexit as well. And he's been allowed on national media saying that it would be a mistake to close down pubs. He's also saying something like, oh, infection rates in pubs are really low, stuff like that. We've no idea what the infection rates in pubs are. And the idea that you get people into a closed space and actively suppress their immune system with your booze and food is somehow going to have a lower infection rate than in any other place, because he wants other businesses to close down. It's just his business. So he says, oh, don't close down bars and restaurants, because that's his business. He's only interested in his own profit, you know. But we're allowing these people onto the media, so people are getting mixed messages. So then you might think to yourself, so, well, okay, but people surely will just listen to the government. No, people at the best of times tend not to trust even decent governments. What we have right now is not a decent government. And I don't mean that because I disagree with them. Even the people who voted for them know that Boris Johnson's a liar. People really do not... There was a TV debate for the general election before Christmas when Boris Johnson tried to say that he was honest. And the audience just laughed, all of them. And bear in mind that audience was split between his opponents and his supporters. But they laughed because even his supporters know he's a liar. And this is the problem. You've got this person coming on. First of all, they know he's a liar, so how can they trust him? Second of all, he keeps contradicting himself. You know, we had a Tory supporting newspaper just a week or so ago saying that people need to follow the government's advice, and actually it is, which you'd say is fair enough if the advice was good, but they said that it's an act of treachery, of treason, to criticise the government's response. And yet the government have changed their response. Are the government traitors now because they haven't followed their own response? They're not following their own response. It's all become very, very messy. We're not getting a consistent message out there. We're not getting a message from people that the public can trust. We're getting the media feeding in all the hysteria. Instead of getting experts on to explain the situation simply and to... Because it's always better. People are always going to be much more on board if they understand the reasons why. We're not a conformist society in this country at all, which is interesting, isn't it? Because when you look at the ones who are a bit more conformist, they tend to have the shallower things. Look at Japan there. But in this country, we are the opposite of that. We're not deferential at all to authority in this country. And at the moment, that means the government can't just advise something and we do it. And if they enforce it, we'll kick back as well. So what happens then when they try and enforce it? And you have to have people arresting those who should be isolating and are not. And that's where the government don't want to go down, because, again, the bulk of their supporters tend to be the ones who respect authority the least. So all these decisions have been made politically. And that's why we're in this ridiculous situation now. We're only just now, this week, closing schools, where, of course, that will help enormously. But then you've got the knock-on effect. You've now got these kids at home. Some of them will just have to look after themselves as their parents go to work if they're old enough to do that. If they're not, and those parents are key workers, then they'll still be in the schools. So when they say the schools are closed, it's partial closure. But we still don't have the details of that as well, and that's another problem. Ultimately, the government is reacting to things. They should have thought about all of these things 2 months ago. Yes, you'd still expect some details to still be worked out. It's not reasonable for the government 2 months ago to have decided on a full action plan that would definitely work and never need changing. Of course not. But there were certain things that they should have known, they were being told will need to happen, but because they didn't accept them, because they didn't believe it, this is where we are now. And we're also in a situation as well, and again, just my final point, again, directly related to Brexit, because it was the only way for them to get the British population to buy Brexit. Remember where we came from. We went from Brexit's going to be brilliant and we're all going to be richer, to, of course, you're going to be poorer, but it's worth it for sovereignty. And that is the attitude people have had, these frothing Brexiteers now. And there's a lot of them in the country, let's not pretend otherwise. And these people are now saying, yes, I know I might lose my job, but it's worth it for Brexit. Or yes, I know, that we're not going to be able to have as much medical treatment. It's worth it for Brexit. Everything is worth it for Brexit. So what you've basically created is a society where a good chunk of it is nihilistic. You try telling a nihilistic population that you've got to suffer some privations, such as staying at home, except for essential travel, or you're going to potentially make someone else sick. Because remember, the majority of us are just going to get a bit ill. We're not actually in serious danger. The problem with this is the people who are, and the people who will never catch this but still die as a result of it, because they need NHS treatment that will not be available to them as our NHS is stretched too much. You try telling a nihilistic population that you have created that you've got to do this thing or else there's this consequence. Nihilist goes, don't care. And that's where we are right now. We'll have to see where we are when, this gets much further along and we really see where we are. But will people pay any more attention to the government unless the government properly crack down? Are we going to end up having to see something extreme from the government in order to get people to follow the advice? Because at the moment, they're just refusing. So anyway, with that cheerful thought, I'll leave it there. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.